And now we're going to go straight to our guests in order to discuss this situation further. Joining us now here on TVP World is Patrick Hilsman, columnist. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good afternoon. Delighted to have you as always. Now, of course, the common narrative is that the students are protesting against the war in Gaza. However, I wanted to take a more in-depth look at what they're protesting against. The divestment of university funds from Israel and Israel-linked companies. Could you shed more light as to what it entails?
Well, the divestment movement has been around for several decades, and what it advocates is an international non-violent response to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. It's referred to colloquially as boycott, divest sanctions, BDS, and several activists on American universities have been requesting that their universities divest money that could be tied into the Israeli military state. And this is one of the principal demands of the protesters.
So naturally, we've also seen these images. Would you agree that overall, going beyond the question of divestment, but also as to the general state of the discussion, right, especially on the university campuses, would you agree with a statement from an article in Vox, which came out recently, that the debate itself is broken and that we need to take it away from radicals on both sides of the discussion?
I think that on its own, that statement is true, that the microphone needs to be taken away from radicals and given to rational people. But I would argue that those protesters that we saw at Columbia University, UCLA, and other universities are actually those moderate voices. A lot of these protests are Jewish-led. They're led by people that have no desire whatsoever to see any kind of anti-Semitism. And we've seen many examples in which agitators that have promoted racist or pro-Putin or pro-Assad or anti-Semitic ideas have been kicked out of these protests. Recently at UCLA, there were protesters trying to fly the Iranian flag and voice support for Assad, and there are reports that they were immediately kicked out. There was a case where at UCLA campus, a racist person drove a van with a Star of David and a swastika too near the campus and started broadcasting anti-Semitic propaganda. But this person was not at all associated with the protesters. I think that really what we're seeing is essentially people who are angry about tens of thousands of deaths in Gaza with U.S. weapons. There certainly are these radicals, but generally speaking, for young people, and young people are sometimes very susceptible to radical ideas, we see a very moderate, reasonable movement on these campuses. And I should add that not only are these protesters giving a voice to people in Gaza, they're also giving a voice to the hostages' families in Israel, because those hostages' families are currently protesting against the Netanyahu government. I truly think that though there are elements of the discourse that are toxic, in some ways we see more unity than ever now.
Right, and President Biden, in response to what has been happening, because if I'm correct, about 80 institutions are involved right now, said that dissent is essential for democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder. But it seems that the disorder was actually created by the police and their reaction to what has been happening.
I completely agree. If President Biden wants to talk about violence, he should address the fact that I believe it was last night, police at the UCLA campus fired what's called sublethal munitions at protesters. That's basically rubber bullets. Now, these things are called less than lethal or sublethal, but they can kill people. And so if you want to talk about violence, there's another example where pro-Israel protesters attacked students at Columbia University a couple months ago with a corrosive chemical. And again at UCLA, pro-Israel protesters violently attacked student demonstrators. Who are the police protesting? Or who are the police protecting at this point? If the idea is the safety of the student, if the idea is the safety of Jewish students, a lot of these protesters are Jewish, and we don't want police firing rubber bullets into crowds of protesters. That's not protecting anyone from anti-Semitism. It's madness.
Right, and if
There's
it happened in any
reports, actually, aren't there? I mean, firing rubber bullets into a crowd.
But if it happened in any other country, I mean, there will be, the voices will be much harsher, right? I mean, of course, we will call it
Yes,
undemocratic and so on and so forth. But because it's the U.S., I would argue that the response has been milder. Now, Nicaragua, right, has tried to stop Germany from sending weapons to Israel through the International Court of Justice. However, this motion was dismissed. Do you think that the issue will return, or perhaps some other countries could be subject to such calls, like perhaps the U.S.?
I do think so, because there's a concept that's called universal jurisdiction, which has been reinforced in recent years with some of the prosecutions of war criminals that were associated with the Assad regime in Syria. Now, under this concept, it means that a crime committed against somebody in another country, let's say Syria, can be prosecuted in a country like Germany. And we see war crimes prosecutions going on right now. As soon as investigators get into Gaza and see some of the things that have been done, it's blatantly clear that war crimes have been committed. And there's not going to be a way to escape legal ramifications. There are precedents for there being legal cases of human rights violators, and a lot of these countries have existing laws that will be related to this. The United States is not supposed to be exporting weapons to countries that use them on civilian populations. Clearly, Israel is using these weapons on civilian populations. There's a lot of precedent for this turning into a legal nightmare for Israel, and they would be wise to accept a ceasefire and a constructive peace settlement, because the actions they have taken are completely outside of the realm of of norms, and they are either genocide or bordering on genocide. And there's very little legal argument that can be made against that at this point. So from a legal perspective, I think they're in trouble.
So one final question. Do you think it would help the protesters to frame these protests as being not anti-Israel, but more anti-Netanyahu government, because they could then find this sort of commonality with many people inside Israel? Would you say that this has really been mostly about the approach taken by this government, or the far-right elements within this government, just pulling Netanyahu in that direction? And it wouldn't perhaps have gone so far if it was somebody else at the helm in Israel at the given time. Obviously, taking into account the fact that the conflict has been going on for a long time, it's not the first time that violence has erupted in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to judge what the reasons are for what's happening, but if the protesters are able to make bridges to protesters in Israel, I feel that they should. But overall, I think that they are basically requesting a stop to policy. There are some people that are chanting things, advocating, for dismantling the entire Israeli state, but that's not the norm. Generally, what people want is democracy. People want one person, one vote, equal rights for everyone between the river and the sea. That's it. And I think that most of these protesters are not radicals. Most of these protesters, even though some of them for political reasons might feel nervous admitting that they agree with a lot of the protesters in Israel, they probably do agree with the protesters in Israel. This is about policy.
Right, you rightly pointed out that it's also about democracy. The First Amendment has been invoked time and time again. And of course, today Poland celebrates the creation of its first constitution. Of course, American Constitution was mentioned time and time again. So hopefully the First Amendment will be taken into consideration. Patrick Hilsman, thank you, sir, for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.